The rain came down in sheets over Camp Claiborne, Louisiana, turning the red dirt into rivers of mud. Sergeant Ruth Johnson stood at attention in the motor pool, her jaw set tight as the white officer walked past her for the third time without acknowledgement. She was one of the few women attached to the 761st Tank Battalion, serving as a communications specialist and mechanic. Her hands were already stained with grease from the morning's work on the Sherman tanks that would soon carry her unit into battle. "You really think they're going to let you people fight?" Private Collins sneered from across the compound. He was part of a white infantry unit training nearby, and he never missed a chance to make his opinions known. "Hitler's boys are going to chew you up and spit you out." Ruth said nothing. She had learned long ago that silence was sometimes the strongest response. But inside, her heart burned with a fierce determination that no amount of mockery could extinguish. She had grown up in Birmingham, Alabama, where she had watched her father work himself to exhaustion in the steel mills, only to be paid half what white men earned. She had seen her mother clean houses for families who wouldn't let her use the front door. Ruth had joined the army to prove something, not just to white America, but to herself. She was worth something. Her people were worth something. The 761st Tank Battalion was an all-black unit, formed in the spring of 1942. By the fall of 1944, they had trained for 2 long years, mastering the art of armored warfare while facing doubt and discrimination at every turn. The Army had been reluctant to put black soldiers in combat roles, believing the racist theories of the time that claimed they lacked the courage and intelligence for battle. Ruth had heard it all. She had been told she was inferior, that her people couldn't handle the stress of combat, that they would run at the first sign of danger. But Ruth knew better. She had grown up watching her community endure hardships that would break most people. She had seen strength in her grandmother's eyes as she told stories of surviving worse than any war. She had witnessed courage every day in the small acts of resistance her neighbors performed just to maintain their dignity. Colonel Paul Bates, the white commanding officer of the 761st, was different from most. He believed in his men and the few women who served alongside them in support roles. He had fought against the Army's prejudices to get his battalion combat ready. When General George Patton came to inspect the unit before they shipped out to Europe, Ruth stood in formation, her spine straight, her eyes forward. Patton paced in front of the assembled soldiers, his pearl-handled pistols gleaming in the weak October sun. "Men, you're the first Negro tankers to ever fight in the American Army," he barked. "I would never have asked for you if you weren't good. I have nothing but the best in my army. I don't care what color you are as long as you go up there and kill those German sons of bitches." It wasn't the most enlightened speech Ruth had ever heard, but it was something. It was acknowledgement. It was a chance. 3 weeks later, Ruth found herself on a transport ship crossing the Atlantic. The seas were rough, and many of the soldiers got sick. Ruth spent her time below deck, checking and rechecking the communication equipment that would be her responsibility once they landed. She wrote letters home to her younger sister, Sarah, who was still in high school. "Don't let anyone tell you what you can't do," Ruth wrote by the dim light of the ship's lamps. "Don't let anyone make you small. We're going over there to fight for freedom, even though we don't have all of it at home. But that's going to change, Sarah. I promise you that's going to change." When they landed in France in late October 1944, the landscape was already scarred by war. Villages lay in ruins. The autumn air smelled of smoke and death. The 761st was attached to General Patton's Third Army, and they were immediately thrust into action near the French town of Moyenvic. Ruth's job was to maintain communication between the tanks and command. She rode in a half-track vehicle, operating the radio equipment that kept the battalion coordinated during battle. It was dangerous work. Communication vehicles were prime targets for enemy artillery, but Ruth had steady hands and a clear head under pressure. The white units they fought alongside were skeptical at best, hostile at worst. Ruth overheard conversations in the mess tents where white soldiers bet on how long the 761st would last before they broke and ran. She heard officers questioning whether black soldiers had the mental capacity for armored warfare. She felt the stares, the whispers, the assumptions. But the 761st had something to prove, and they were ready to prove it with blood and steel. The first major engagement came quickly. The battalion was ordered to attack German positions near the town of Morville-Lesvik. Ruth sat in her half-track, headphones on, coordinating the movements of 5 Sherman tanks as they rolled through the muddy fields toward enemy lines. The Germans had dug in with anti-tank guns and machine gun nests. It would be a brutal fight. "Red Leader, this is command." Ruth spoke calmly into her microphone, though her heart hammered in her chest. "Enemy position at 2 o'clock, range 300 yards. Proceed with caution." The radio crackled back. "Roger, command, moving in." The Sherman tanks rumbled forward, their cannons blazing. The sound was deafening. German shells screamed overhead, exploding in the mud around Ruth's vehicle. Shrapnel pinged off the armor plating. The driver next to her, a young man named Williams from Chicago, gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. "We're going to make it," Ruth said firmly, as much to herself as to him. "Keep steady." The battle lasted 6 hours. When it was over, the 761st had taken their objective, but at a cost. 2 tanks were destroyed. 5 men were killed. Ruth had never seen death up close before. The bodies were brought back covered in canvas, and she helped load them into the trucks that would take them to the Graves registration unit. Her hands shook as she worked, but she didn't cry. Not yet. There wasn't time for tears. That night, Colonel Bates gathered the unit. His face was grim, but there was pride in his eyes. "You did well today," he said simply. "You proved what I already knew. You're soldiers, real soldiers." Ruth lay in her tent that night, exhausted but unable to sleep. She thought about the men who had died. She thought about the Germans they had killed. She thought about the white soldiers who had bet against them. Tomorrow they would fight again, and the day after that, and the day after that. The war was just beginning for the 761st Tank Battalion. They didn't know it yet, but they would fight for 183 consecutive days without relief, longer than any other armored unit in World War II. They would earn a reputation as some of the fiercest fighters in Europe. And Ruth Johnson would be there for all of it, keeping them connected, keeping them fighting, proving every single doubter wrong. November 1944 brought rain that seemed like it would never end. The fields of France turned into vast seas of mud that sucked at the tank treads and made every movement exhausting. Ruth's hands were perpetually cold and wet as she worked on the radio equipment in the back of the half-track. The Germans were putting up fierce resistance as Patton's Third Army pushed toward the German border. The 761st was sent wherever the fighting was hardest. They broke through the Siegfried Line defenses. They liberated French towns where grateful civilians emerged from cellars to throw flowers at the black tankers, tears streaming down their faces. For many of these French citizens, it didn't matter what color the Americans were. They were liberators, and that was all that mattered. But for every moment of gratitude, there were reminders of the prejudice that followed the 761st like a shadow. Ruth watched as white military police harassed soldiers from her unit during their brief rest periods. She saw her fellow soldiers denied service at clubs where white soldiers drank freely. She heard the complaints from white units who didn't want to fight alongside Negroes. Staff Sergeant David Harper, one of the tank commanders Ruth worked closely with, summed it up one cold evening as they ate their rations huddled next to a half-destroyed barn. "We're good enough to die for them, but not good enough to drink with them," he said bitterly. "Back home, my daddy told me it would be like this. I didn't want to believe him." Ruth looked at Harper, a man who had knocked out 3 German tanks in a single engagement the week before. "Then we fight twice as hard," she said quietly. "We make them see us, we make them respect us, and when we go home, we use what we learned here to fight for respect there too." Harper smiled, but it was a tired smile. "You're tougher than most of us, Ruth, you know that." She shook her head. "I'm just doing what needs to be done, same as everyone else." But the truth was, Ruth was exhausted. The constant combat was wearing on everyone. They rarely got more than a few hours of sleep before they were moving again, attacking another German position, clearing another town. Ruth's role meant she was in constant danger. Communication vehicles were priority targets. She had already survived 3 close calls where shells landed near enough to rock her vehicle and fill the air with deadly fragments. In late November, the battalion was ordered to assault the town of Gebling. Intelligence said it was lightly defended. Intelligence was wrong. The Germans had fortified the town with multiple anti-tank guns, machine gun positions, and a company of infantry. When the 761st tanks rolled in, they were met with a storm of fire. Ruth was coordinating 4 tank platoons, trying to keep them organized as the battle descended into chaos. Through her headphones, she heard the commanders shouting, reporting enemy positions, calling for support. One tank was hit and burst into flames. The crew tried to bail out, but German machine gun fire cut them down. "Command, this is Red 3. a panicked voice came through. We're taking heavy fire from the church tower. Request immediate support. Ruth's mind raced. She checked her map, coordinated with the artillery observer attached to their unit, and called in fire support. Minutes later, American artillery shells screamed overhead and demolished the church tower in a cascade of stone and dust. The battle for Gebling lasted 2 days. House-to-house fighting, tank duels in narrow streets, men dying in the mud. When it was finally over, the 761st had taken the town, but 23 men were casualties. Ruth helped evacuate the wounded, her uniform soaked with rain and blood that wasn't her own. A white lieutenant from a nearby infantry unit watched the 761st regroup after the battle. Ruth saw him talking to his sergeant, both men looking at the black tankers with what seemed like newfound respect. The lieutenant approached Colonel Bates and said something Ruth couldn't hear. Bates nodded, and the lieutenant walked away. Later, Bates shared what was said. He wanted to know if we were available to support his unit in their next attack, said he'd rather have us than any white armored unit he'd worked with. Bates allowed himself a small smile. Words getting around, soldiers. You're making believers out of them. But Ruth knew respect earned in blood was a heavy price. She wrote to her sister that night, though she couldn't say much because of censorship. We're doing our part, Sarah. It's harder than I ever imagined. I've seen things I'll never forget, but we're proving ourselves. Every single day, we're proving we belong. December brought the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last desperate offensive in the West. The 761st was rushed north to help contain the German breakthrough. They fought in snow and freezing temperatures, their tanks struggling in the winter conditions. Ruth's fingers grew numb as she operated the radio equipment, but she never faltered. The battalion fought at Tillet, at Bostonia, breaking through German lines to relieve surrounded American units. One night, Ruth's half-track was hit by German mortar fire. The explosion threw her against the side of the vehicle, knocking her unconscious. When she came to, Williams, the driver, was shaking her, blood running down his face from a cut on his forehead. Sergeant Johnson, Ruth, can you hear me? She nodded groggily, her ears were ringing. The radio equipment was destroyed, sparking and smoking. I'm okay, she managed to say. How bad is it? Radio's gone. We need to get to another vehicle. They abandoned the damaged half-track and made it back to the battalion's position on foot, moving through the darkness with German positions all around them. It was the longest hour of Ruth's life. Every shadow could be an enemy soldier. Every sound could be their death approaching. But they made it back alive. Colonel Bates looked relieved when he saw her. Johnson, I thought we'd lost you. Not yet, sir, she replied, standing at attention despite her exhaustion. Permission to get back to work. He shook his head in amazement. Get yourself checked by the medic first. That's an order. The medic found she had a concussion and multiple bruises, but nothing broken. He wanted to send her to the rear for recovery. Ruth refused. My unit needs me, she said firmly. I'm staying. And she did. Through December and into January 1945, the 761st kept fighting. They were in combat every single day, pushing the Germans back, liberating towns, destroying enemy tanks and positions. Other units were rotated out for rest. The 761st kept going. It seemed the army had decided that since they were performing so well, they couldn't be spared. Ruth lost track of how many battles they fought. The days blurred together into a continuous nightmare of violence and exhaustion. She saw friends die. She saw men lose limbs, lose their minds, lose their will to go on. But the 761st never broke. They never ran. They never gave up. By late January, they had been in continuous combat for 90 days. 90 days without relief, without rest, without a break from the killing. Ruth looked at herself in a broken mirror in a liberated French farmhouse and barely recognized the woman staring back. Her face was gaunt, her eyes hollow. She had lost weight she couldn't afford to lose, but she was still standing, still fighting, still proving the doubters wrong. The German soldiers they captured were often shocked to find themselves taken prisoner by Black Americans. Some refused to believe it. Others looked at these fierce warriors with fear and respect. The myth of inferiority was dying in the mud and blood of Europe, one battle at a time. February 1945 brought the 761st Tank Battalion to Germany itself. They crossed the border and began fighting on enemy soil, pushing toward the heart of the Third Reich. The German resistance grew more desperate. Hitler's army was collapsing, but cornered animals fight hardest, and the Wehrmacht was no exception. Ruth had been promoted to technical sergeant, recognizing her skill and bravery under fire. She now coordinated communications for the entire battalion, a massive responsibility that kept her working 18-hour days. She had a new half-track, better armored than the last, but she knew armor was no guarantee of survival. She had seen too many tanks turned into burning coffins to believe in guaranteed safety. The battalion fought through the German towns of the Rhineland. Each village was a fortress. Each house had to be cleared. The Germans were fighting for their homeland now, and they fought with fanatic determination. Ruth watched American and German young men die in equal measure, and she wondered what any of it meant. Freedom? Democracy? Or just men killing men because old men in distant capitals said they should? But then they found the first camp. It was a work camp attached to a factory, not one of the major death camps, but terrible enough. The prisoners were skeletal, barely alive, worked and starved to the edge of death. Most were political prisoners, resistance fighters, Jews who had somehow survived this long. When the 761st liberated the camp, Ruth saw hell on earth. She helped distribute food to the prisoners, though the medics warned they had to be careful not to feed them too much too fast or their shrunken stomachs would rupture. An elderly Jewish man grabbed Ruth's hand with surprising strength, tears streaming down his face. He spoke in broken English. "You are angels," he said, "black angels sent by God." Ruth felt tears in her own eyes for the first time since the war began. "We're just soldiers, sir, just doing our job." He shook his head. "No, you are more, you are hope." That night Ruth sat alone and finally allowed herself to cry. She cried for the dead. She cried for the suffering she had witnessed. She cried for herself and the innocence she had lost somewhere in the blood-soaked fields of Europe. And then she dried her tears, squared her shoulders, and got back to work. There were more towns to liberate, more battles to fight, more people to save. The battalion pushed on toward Austria. They fought at Coburg, at Straubing, at the Steyr River. 150 days of continuous combat, then 160, then 170. Other units would fight for a few weeks and then get pulled back for rest and refit. The 761st just kept going, like an unstoppable machine made of flesh and steel and determination. Staff Sergeant Harper was killed in March, hit by a German Panzerfaust as his tank led an assault on a fortified town. Ruth had talked to him just hours before. He had been looking forward to going home, to seeing his family, to showing them the medals he had earned. Now he was gone, another casualty of a war that seemed to devour young men without end. Ruth stood at the brief memorial service, watching as Harper's personal effects were packed to be sent home. His tank, patched up and repaired, was assigned to a new crew. The war didn't pause for grief. It never did. But something was building in Ruth, a cold anger that kept her going when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her. She was angry at the Germans for starting this war, angry at the Americans for treating her people as inferior while demanding they die for a country that denied them basic rights, angry at a world that measured human worth by the color of skin. But she channeled that anger into her work, into keeping her soldiers alive, into doing her job with an excellence that could not be denied. In April, word came down that the war was nearly over. The German army was collapsing. Hitler was rumored to be dead or dying. The end was in sight. The 761st pushed into Austria, racing to link up with Soviet forces coming from the east. On May 5, 1945, they reached the town of Steyr, and there they finally stopped. 183 days. That's how long the 761st Tank Battalion fought without relief. 183 consecutive days of combat, longer than any other armored unit in the war. They had fought in 6 European countries. They had liberated more than 30 towns. They had destroyed or captured hundreds of enemy vehicles and thousands of enemy soldiers. And they had paid for it with the lives of 71 men killed, more than 300 wounded. Ruth stood in the town square of Steyr on May 8, 1945, VE Day, victory in Europe. The war was over. She had survived. Around her, soldiers celebrated, but she felt strangely empty. She had spent so long focused on survival, on the next battle, the next mission, that she didn't know how to feel about it being finished. Colonel Bates assembled the battalion one last time before they began the long process of going home. "You have written a proud chapter in American history," he told them. "You proved that courage has no color, that skill has no race, that valor and honor belong to those who earn them, not to those who claim them by birth. You are heroes, every one of you, and I am honored to have served with you." Ruth felt pride, yes, but also a deep weariness. She thought about going home to Birmingham, to a city where she still couldn't eat at the same lunch counter as white people. where she would still be expected to move to the back of the bus, where her service and sacrifice would be dismissed or ignored by many. She had fought for her country, had proven herself under the worst conditions imaginable, and she knew that many Americans would still see only her skin color, not her character or her courage. But she also knew something had changed. She had changed. All of them had changed. They had learned they could do anything, overcome anything, survive anything, and they would take that knowledge home with them. The fight wasn't over. It was just moving to a different battlefield. "What are you going to do when you get home?" Williams asked her as they waited for transport to the staging areas where they would begin the journey back to America. Ruth thought about her sister Sarah, about the letters she had sent encouraging her to be strong, to demand respect, to never accept being treated as less than equal. "I'm going to keep fighting," she said simply. "Just in a different way. What about you?" Williams smiled. "Same. My grandfather was born a slave. My father lived under Jim Crow. But me? I'm going to live free, truly free, or die trying. This war taught me I'm just as good as any man, white or black, and I'm never going to forget that." Around them, the men and women of the 761st began to pack up, to prepare for the journey home. They had gone to war dismissed as inferior, doubted at every turn, given the most dangerous missions because their lives were considered less valuable. And they had responded with a valor and determination that shamed their doubters and earned the respect of those who fought beside them. But Ruth knew the hardest truth of all: respect earned in war doesn't always transfer to peace. The real battle was just beginning. The journey home took 6 weeks. Ruth stood at the rail of the transport ship as it entered New York Harbor in June 1945, watching the Statue of Liberty grow larger on the horizon. She remembered seeing it when she had shipped out 8 months earlier, wondering if she would ever see it again. Now here she was, alive against the odds, forever changed by what she had witnessed and done. But the welcome home was not what she had hoped for. While white units returned to ticker-tape parades and celebrations, the 761st received a subdued acknowledgement. They were quietly mustered out, given their discharge papers, and sent home with little fanfare. The newspapers barely mentioned them. The newsreels focused on white heroes. It was as if the 761st's 183 days of combat had never happened. Ruth returned to Birmingham in July, stepping off the train in her uniform with her sergeant's stripes and her combat infantry badge. Her family was there to meet her, her mother crying with relief, her father standing proud but silent, her sister Sarah rushing forward to embrace her. "You're home," Sarah whispered. "You're really home." "I'm home," Ruth agreed, but even as she said it, she felt like a stranger in her own city. She had seen the world. She had faced death. She had proven herself in ways most people never would. But here she was, back in a place where she was still expected to know her place, to accept limitations, to be less than what she knew she was. The reality hit her the very next day when she tried to eat at a downtown diner. She was still in uniform, wearing her medals. The white owner took one look at her and pointed to the back door. "Coloreds eat in the kitchen," he said flatly. Ruth felt anger rise in her chest. She had fought for this country. She had risked her life. Men she cared about had died. And this man was telling her she couldn't sit at his lunch counter. But she was tired, still adjusting to being home, and she didn't have the energy to fight this battle today. She turned and walked out, her face burning with humiliation and rage. That night she told Sarah what had happened. Her sister, now 18 and about to start college, looked at her with fierce eyes. "How can they treat you like this, after everything you did?" "Because they can," Ruth said bitterly. "Because the law says they can, because we're still not seen as equal no matter what we accomplish." Sarah grabbed her hand. "Then we change the law, we fight back. You taught me that, Ruth. In your letters, you told me never to accept being made small, so let's not accept it. Not anymore." Over the next few weeks, Ruth connected with other veterans from the 761st who had returned home. Many of them felt the same frustration. They had served their country with distinction, had earned medals and commendations, and had come home to the same discrimination they had left behind. It was as if the war had changed nothing. But it had changed them. Staff Sergeant Williams, who had survived the entire war without a scratch, organized a meeting at a black church in Birmingham. More than 30 veterans showed up. Ruth stood and spoke, telling her story, sharing her frustration. Others did the same. And slowly a plan began to form. "We can't fight this alone," Williams said. "But we don't have to. The war showed us that when we stand together, when we prove our worth, people have to recognize it. So that's what we do. We organize, we speak out. We demand the rights we earned with our blood. Ruth became involved in the growing civil rights movement in Birmingham. She gave talks at churches and community centers, sharing her experiences in the war, making the case that Black Americans had proven their equality on the battlefield and deserved equality at home. She was a powerful speaker, her words carrying the weight of hard-won experience. But the recognition they deserved from the military itself remained elusive. While white units received Presidential Unit citations and other honors, the 761st was overlooked. Their commander, Colonel Bates, had recommended them for a Presidential Unit citation in 1945, but it went nowhere. It seemed the Army wanted to forget about the Black Panthers, to let their story fade into obscurity. Ruth wouldn't let it fade. She wrote letters to newspapers, to congressmen, to anyone who would listen. She detailed the 761st's record: 183 days of combat, 6 countries, 30 towns liberated, hundreds of enemy vehicles destroyed, 391 decorated soldiers, including 11 Silver Stars and 69 Bronze Stars. These were facts that could not be denied, but they were being ignored. In 1947, Ruth was invited to speak at a veterans event in Washington, D.C. It was supposed to be a small gathering, but word spread, and more than 500 people showed up, Black and white, veterans and civilians. Ruth stood at the podium, looking out at the sea of faces, and spoke from her heart. "We went to Europe as doubted soldiers," she said. "We were told we were inferior, that we lacked courage, that we would fail. The Germans believed it, many Americans believed it, but we didn't believe it. We knew who we were, and for 183 days we proved it. We fought longer without relief than any other armored unit in the war. We bled the same red blood. We showed the same courage. We earned the same respect. But we have not received the same recognition, and I'm here to ask why. Why are our sacrifices worth less? Why are our stories untold? Why must we fight twice, once against the enemy abroad and once for recognition at home?" The applause was thunderous. People stood, some with tears in their eyes. A white veteran from the 101st Airborne approached Ruth after the speech, his hand extended. "I fought in Europe too," he said. "I heard about the 761st. What you did was remarkable. You should be celebrated, not ignored." "Thank you," Ruth said, shaking his hand. "Help us make sure our story is told. That's all we ask." The event got coverage in several newspapers. Slowly, very slowly, awareness began to grow. But still, the official recognition didn't come. The Army remained silent. The Presidential Unit citation remained ungranted. It was as if the bureaucracy itself couldn't admit that Black soldiers had performed with such extraordinary valor. Ruth returned to Birmingham and continued her work. She got a job teaching at a Black school, sharing her experiences with young students, encouraging them to dream beyond the limitations society tried to impose on them. She became active in voter registration drives, helping Black citizens navigate the deliberately difficult process of registering to vote in the Jim Crow South. In 1955, when Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a bus in Montgomery, Ruth was one of the first to join the boycott. She had fought Germans in Europe. She wasn't afraid of racist bus companies in Alabama. She organized carpools, raised money for the cause, and spoke at rallies alongside Martin Luther King Jr. and other civil rights leaders. "This is what we fought for," she told crowds. "Not just to defeat Hitler's racism abroad, but to defeat racism at home. We didn't fight 183 days straight to come home and sit in the back of the bus. We didn't watch our brothers die to accept second-class citizenship. We fought for freedom, real freedom, and we won't stop fighting until we have it." The civil rights movement was gaining momentum, but Ruth knew it was only the beginning. Real change would take decades. The recognition the 761st deserved seemed farther away than ever, but she refused to give up. Giving up wasn't in her nature. The war had taught her that. Her sister Sarah, inspired by Ruth's example, became a lawyer, one of the first Black women to practice law in Alabama. Together, the Johnson sisters became forces for change in their community. They fought segregation in courts and in streets, in schools and in businesses. They made people uncomfortable, and they didn't care. Comfort was for those who could afford it. They were fighting for justice. But always in the back of Ruth's mind was the unfairness of the 761st treatment. They had done everything asked of them and more. They had written one of the most remarkable chapters in American military history, and they had been forgotten, their story untold, their valor unrecognized. It was a wound that wouldn't heal, a wrong that demanded righting. And Ruth Johnson was a woman who didn't accept wrongs quietly. Part 5, Recognition at Last. The years passed. The 1960s brought progress and pain, victories and setbacks. Ruth marched in Birmingham alongside thousands of others, facing fire hoses and police dogs. She was arrested twice for civil disobedience and wore her arrest records as badges of honor. She lived to see the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, achievements she had fought for, even as she knew the struggle was far from over. But through it all, the story of the 761st remained largely untold. The men who had fought so bravely were growing older. Some had died without ever receiving proper recognition for their service. Ruth attended funerals for comrades from the war, men she had served beside, men who had saved her life and whose lives she had helped save. Each funeral felt like another injustice, another hero going to his grave without the honor he deserved. In 1978, Ruth was invited to speak at a military history conference in Washington, D.C. She was 62 years old now, her hair gray, her body bearing the aches of age and old injuries. But her mind was sharp and her passion was undimmed. She stood before an audience of historians and military officers and told the story of the 761st Tank Battalion, speaking for more than an hour without notes, painting a vivid picture of those 183 days of combat. When she finished, the room was silent. Then a young Army captain stood and asked the question that had haunted Ruth for decades. Why hasn't this unit received a Presidential Unit Citation? Ruth looked him in the eye. You tell me, Captain, you're part of the Army. Why has my unit been overlooked for 33 years while white units with less distinguished records have been honored? The captain had no answer, but the question hung in the air, and it was reported in the military journals that covered the conference. Slowly, pressure began to build. Historians started researching the 761st's record. Veterans groups began asking questions. Members of Congress started to pay attention. In 1979, the Army began a formal review of the 761st Tank Battalion's service record. Ruth was interviewed extensively, as were other surviving veterans. They provided documentation, after-action reports, commendations from commanders, testimony from white soldiers who had fought alongside them. The evidence was overwhelming. And yet the review dragged on. 1980 became 1981. Ruth's health began to fail. She developed heart problems, a legacy of the stress and hardship she had endured during the war and the decades of activism afterward. Her doctors told her to slow down, to rest, to take it easy. I'll rest when the job is done, she told them. In 1982, Sarah called Ruth with news. They're going to do it, she said, her voice choked with emotion. The Presidential Unit Citation, it's going to happen. Ruth felt tears spring to her eyes. Are you certain? I'm certain. The Army announced it today. The ceremony will be in January 1983. Ruth hung up the phone and sat in her living room, overwhelmed with emotion. 38 years. It had taken 38 years for the country to officially recognize what the 761st had accomplished. So many of the men who had earned this honor were already gone. Harper, Williams, dozens of others who had fought and survived only to die without seeing justice done. But it was happening. Finally, it was happening. On January 24, 1983, in a ceremony at the White House, President Jimmy Carter awarded the Presidential Unit Citation to the 761st Tank Battalion. Ruth stood with the other surviving veterans, tears streaming down her face as the citation was read. The 761st Tank Battalion distinguished itself by extraordinary heroism in action during the period 31 October 1944 to 6 May 1945, in France, Belgium, Luxembourg, Germany, and Austria. Ruth thought about the young woman who had stood in the motor pool at Camp Claiborne in 1944, enduring insults and doubt. She thought about the battles, the friends lost, the fear and courage and determination. She thought about coming home to a country that tried to make her invisible, tried to deny her and her comrades their due recognition. But they had never been invisible. They had always been there, their deeds written in the history books even if no one wanted to read those pages. And now, at last, the story was being told. The Black Panthers of the 761st Tank Battalion were being honored as they should have been in 1945. After the ceremony, a young black Army lieutenant approached Ruth. She was perhaps 25, her uniform crisp, her bearing confident. "Sergeant Johnson," she said, saluting. Ruth returned the salute, though she had been a civilian for decades. Yes. I just wanted to thank you for what you did, for making it possible for people like me to serve, for proving that we belong. Ruth looked at this young woman, saw the pride in her eyes, the confidence in her bearing, and felt a wave of emotion. This was why it had all been worth it. The war, the struggle, the decades of fighting for recognition. It was for this moment, for this young woman who could serve without the same doubts and restrictions Ruth had faced. You don't need to thank me, Ruth said gently. Just serve with honor, tell the story, make sure it's never forgotten. I will, I promise. Ruth went home to Birmingham that night, exhausted but fulfilled. The recognition had come late, far too late for many, but it had come. The story of the 761st was now part of the official record. Future generations would know what they had accomplished. But the story wasn't quite over. In 1997, 14 years after the Presidential Unit Citation, another honor came. 7 members of the 761st, including some who had served after Ruth had known them, were awarded the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest military decoration. It was another acknowledgement of extraordinary valor, another correction of historical injustice. Ruth, now 81 years old and in declining health, watched the ceremony on television from her hospital bed. She held Sarah's hand as the medals were presented to surviving families and the few remaining veterans. She thought about the young men she had known, the faces that still appeared in her dreams after all these years. We did it, she whispered to Sarah. We proved them all wrong. Sarah squeezed her hand. You did more than that, Ruth. You changed the world. Ruth smiled. No, we changed it together, all of us. That's what the 761st taught me. One person can be dismissed, ignored, denied. But people standing together, people refusing to accept injustice, people demanding their rights that can't be stopped. Ruth Johnson died in 1999 at the age of 83. Her funeral in Birmingham was attended by hundreds, including veterans from the 761st, civil rights leaders, and 3 generations of students she had taught and inspired. The Army sent an honor guard. A young black general gave the eulogy, speaking of Ruth's courage in war and in peace, her refusal to accept injustice, her lifelong fight for recognition and equality. In her will, Ruth left her medals and papers to a museum dedicated to black military history. She wanted young people to know the story, to understand that their ancestors had fought and sacrificed and achieved great things, even when the world tried to deny their accomplishments. The 761st Tank Battalion's legacy lives on. Their story is taught in military schools. Their name is remembered with honor. The Black Panthers who fought 183 days without rest, who proved that valor knows no color, who earned the respect of allies and enemies alike, are finally recognized as the heroes they always were. And Ruth Johnson, the young woman who was dismissed and doubted, who proved herself under fire, who came home to continued injustice and spent the rest of her life fighting for recognition and equality, is remembered too. Not just as a veteran, but as a warrior in multiple wars, a teacher, an activist, a woman who refused to be made small, who insisted on justice even when it took decades to arrive. Her story, like the story of the 761st, is a reminder that some battles are won quickly, but the most important ones require persistence, courage, and an unwillingness to give up even when victory seems impossible. The Germans dismissed the 761st as inferior. They were proved wrong in 183 days of combat. America tried to dismiss them too, tried to minimize their achievements, tried to make them invisible. But the truth has a way of emerging, and heroes have a way of being recognized even if justice comes late. The 761st Tank Battalion and soldiers like Ruth Johnson ensured that their story would be told, their sacrifices honored, and their legacy preserved for generations to come. They fought for recognition, and they won. They fought for equality, and they advanced the cause. They fought for justice, and they achieved it, even if they had to wait decades to see it. In the end, they proved the most important truth of all. Courage, honor, and excellence belong to those who demonstrate them, regardless of the color of their skin. And that truth, once proven, can never be unproven, no matter how long it takes the world to acknowledge it.